Welcome to the German Marshall Fund of the United States. My name is Jörg Forbrig. I'm Director for Central and Eastern Europe at the German Marshall Fund. I have the pleasure today of hosting and leading us all through this session. The session is titled Hungarian Elections, Scenarios and Implications for Euro-Atlantic Partners. Let me perhaps start this on a personal note. I graduated from Central European University at the very moment when Viktor Orbán became Prime Minister of Hungary for the very first time in 1998. None of us probably would have thought that 24 years later we would be discussing whether Hungary can hold democratic elections, whether it would be a reliable partner for its European, for its transatlantic allies. And nonetheless, today we're exactly discussing those questions, whether on Sunday, this coming Sunday, the elections in Hungary will be democratic, and of course also what they will mean for many of us in neighboring countries, countries that are partners of Hungary. What are those scenarios that Sunday's elections will produce? What are those consequences that will arise for all of us? Those are the two sort of key angles that we're here to discuss today. And for discussing those, we have three excellent panelists and discussants. First of these is Daniel Hegedüs, my colleague and fellow for Central Europe here at the German Marshall Fund. He has just put out a paper, an analysis on exactly those questions. I will share the link later on in our session, but Daniel obviously will also present some of his findings from that paper in our discussion today. Great to have you, Daniel. Second is Zsuzsanna Végh. She's a research fellow at the European University in Frankfurt-Oder, Viadrina. She's also an alumna of a GMF program, Rethink CE Fellowship. It's great to have you here, Zsuzsanna. And finally, we have Dominik Istrate, who's an analyst who looks at Central and Eastern European affairs at foreign policy. Dominik, it's great to have you.
Thank you very much.
Now, before we start, let me do a few housekeeping rules. First of all, you may have noticed that the session is being recorded. We do that as a standard with GMF sessions of this kind in order to be able to put them out through our YouTube channel later on. And we obviously hope that you will all agree being recorded with this session. The second is we will start now with brief inputs from our three speakers, from Daniel, Zsuzsanna, and Dominik. And then we will open for discussion. For that purpose, we will use exclusively the chat and the question-answer functions. You should feel free anytime already in the course of the presentations to put in any questions that you may have to the speakers. I will then make sure that we pick them up, paraphrase them, and put them to our speakers. Those are basically the two things to keep in mind for the session. Other than that, it's all Hungary's elections on the 3rd of April. And we'll start with Daniel, who gives us a number of scenarios as to what may happen on Sunday. Daniel?
Thank you so much, Jörg. Thank you for the kind introduction. Please bear with me for a second until I share my screen with you. Can you see the PowerPoint presentation? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. The paper I will be talking about covers the 5 most likely election scenarios and their main foreign policy implications for the Euro-Atlantic partners. It also provides an overview of the election landscape playing field in the country, and because that became one of the most crucial issues in the election campaign, the reactions of the Hungarian government on the Russian aggression in Ukraine. However, in this presentation, I will only speak about the 5 scenarios, and because I have less than 2 minutes to introduce each of them, of course, the presentation will be a bit superficial. But if you are interested, then of course you can find more fine-grained information in the policy paper, especially regarding the theory of change behind the individual scenarios, and also regarding the details of the foreign policy implications. So please check the link what Jörg will share with you. Here you can see the 5 scenarios. The first 2 of them relates to a potential Fidesz victory in the elections. The third fleshes out the consequences of a kind of significantly rigged election in Hungary. I will use this term of significantly rigged election because neither the 2014 nor the 2018 elections have been fair in the country, so some are arguing that those were rigged elections as well. I use significantly rigged election in the meaning that election day irregularities can decide about the fact who will enter government after the elections. And the last 2 scenarios relates to the foreign policy implications of an eventual opposition victory on the elections. So starting with the first scenario I baptized faked Atlanticism, I would like to emphasize that from an electoral perspective, this is the most likely scenario based on the most likely outcome, which is a kind of stable Fidesz majority, somewhere in the range between 114 or 125 MPs out of 199, but without reaching the threshold of constitutional supermajority. In this case, we go out from the perception that election day irregularities fall short of the outright rigged election, but especially due to the fact what central role Hungarian foreign policy and the war in Ukraine has played in the election campaign, there will be a kind of pressure on the government to readjust and try to broaden its electoral base, because the election outcome will be seen as a kind of reduced majority, reduced popular support behind the Hungarian multivectoral foreign policy, and in this regard, we will see concerning the foreign policy implications a continuous superficial realignment with Western partners. Why I am emphasizing that continues? Because in my eyes, it will be practically the sustaining of the dual strategy which was pursued by the Hungarian government since the outbreak of the war. This dual strategy was characterized by different behavior at multilateral and unilateral level. In multilateral institutions, practically the Hungarian government tried to give a kind of play the role of a constructive partner. It supported all joint EU and NATO position. And to be fair, most international partners expected a kind of much worse behavior from the Orban regime than actually the strategy pursued by the Hungarian government. However, at unilateral level, the Hungarian government refused to provide any sort of military aid or support to Ukraine, not only lethal military aid, but also non-lethal military aid, and also prohibited the use of the territory of Hungary to transport such aid to Ukraine. And in the domestic scene, the dominance of the pro-Russian narrative was kept in the government-friendly media. So if you would like to summarize in one phrase the real essence of this dual strategy, that is that blocking nothing, but not doing any more than that with regard to Ukraine. And that sort of superficial realignment will be practically sustained in this scenario. Many experts and observers expected a kind of genuine U-turn into transatlantic direction, especially after the election. I don't share this position because I would like to argue that even a sustained realignment will remain superficial for 2 reasons. There are significant structural constraints both at tactical level and at strategic level. At tactical level, there are red lines what cannot be crossed by the Orban government, not even in the future, because that would be just the straight opposite of its former foreign policy positions. That is first and foremost the cutting of energy ties with Russia, and second, providing military aid to Ukraine. But potentially more importantly, I think it must be emphasized that the multivectoral foreign policy of the Orban governments went hand in hand with the country's autocratization over the past 12 years. And it's an essential part of that. Strategic ties with Russia and China were kept to provide leverage over EU institutions and to demonstrate that the country has strategic alternatives in case if the European Union or other Western organization would try to sanction Hungary. And against that background, I think without a genuine redemocratization of the country, a genuine deviation from the multivectoral foreign policy is not possible as well. And finally, I just would like to emphasize that in short term, this scenario could represent a kind of acceptable compromise for most of Hungary's Euro-Atlantic partners, for the very simple reason because now the main focus is on keeping the unity of EU and NATO and preserving their decision-making capabilities. So I think as long as Hungary is not threatening to block decision-making, multilateral decision-making in these organizations, it is a fair price for Western partners to accept a sort of multilateral foreign policy or a continuous autocratization of the country. If we switch to the second scenario, the base election scenario is that due to a kind of sudden breakdown of the opposition campaign or a very successful mobilization on the part of Fidesz during the past week, Fidesz will be able to cross the threshold of supermajority. And it will bring not only international partners, but also Prime Minister Viktor Orbán in a very interesting situation, because of course that will strengthen his position and will demonstrate the popular support behind the government's peace policy, its equidistance to Russia and Ukraine, and will provide or increase his leeway. But it will also increase the domestic costs of any big change in the main foreign policy direction away from multivectoralism. And therefore, in this scenario, I'm arguing that a two-thirds supermajority will put practically Hungarian multivectoralism on steroids. In case of a Russian military victory over the past couple of months, Hungary will be happy to revert back to play the role of one of the key advocates of the Kremlin in the European Union. And I think we shouldn't disguise ourselves there. Prime Minister Orbán won't be the sole European actor who will act in this sense. And if the war in Ukraine continues, a strengthened Orbán could even ask a higher price from its international partners, transatlantic and European partners, to keep a minimum level of cooperation. And partners will be aware that the damage which Prime Minister Orbán can be caused by blockades or vetoes in the NATO and EU decision-making structures, that this damage can be higher than the price of buying the cooperation of the Orbán regime. And in this scenario, I'm straightforwardly arguing that in case of a two-thirds majority, there is a high chance that international partners will turn a blind eye to the further autocratization of Hungary in order to keep a minimum level of unity in EU and NATO. And in that case, I think we could argue that such a scenario would more or less mean the abandoning of the democratic credentials of the European Union for good. Concerning the third scenario, which is titled the stolen elections, the election outcome scenario is that Fidesz wins the election narrowly, but election day irregularities will be so intense that it raised a serious concern about the legitimacy of the election results. There will be widespread protests in the country. There will be a certain risk of violent escalation as well in a spontaneous formats. And claims of the election fraud will make it impossible for the united opposition to recognize the election results and to concede defeat. Of course, in short term, it will cause instability, political instability in the country, with all of the appropriate economic repercussions, a very strong weakening of the national currency, the downgrading of Hungary's credit ratings, and of course, it can end in a political stalemate. And concerning the foreign policy implications, such a scenario would pose, especially the European Union, a dilemma: how to react to the first significantly rigged elections ever in the history of the European integration. And I would like to argue that it's a very hard dilemma, because practically transatlantic and Euro-Atlantic partners have only bad choices in this case. If EU institutions and member states were to recognize the results of the elections, even if it were rigged, that would be really a fatal blow to the democracy credentials of the European Union, and it would practically mean the end of the European integration as a normative project. However, if they don't, then the worst case scenario can be that there will be a non-recognized government in an EU member state for the unforeseeable future. Because the leverage of EU institutions to push Prime Minister Orban out of power, even in the case of a stolen election, is very, very moderate. Of course, the European Union could proceed with the Article 7 procedure and suspend the voting rights of the Hungarian government, but I don't think that it would really impress Prime Minister Orban in that case. But there is hardly any legal opportunity for targeted sanctions against key individuals of the regime. Of course, the United States can impose such sanctions, but within the European Union, from a legal perspective, it's nearly impossible. So the most what EU member states could do would be practically the freezing of the bilateral relations in a very similar manner than it happened in 2000 during the Austrian crisis. And the question is whether it could result in anything else than in a stalemate and pushing Prime Minister Orban more firmly in the arms of Russia and China, who will, of course, don't hesitate for a minute to recognize the election results of even a seriously rigged election in Hungary. And I think it's this scenario is very interesting from the perspective because that it demonstrates that the European Union has even fewer options to challenge the autocratization in the member states if it doesn't happen in an incremental way, but in a rather sudden and decisive mode. So getting rid of a completely autocratized member state in the European Union is, from a legal perspective, also nearly impossible. So after all of these rather gloomy scenarios, let's take a look whether an opposition victory could be less challenging for international partners. And although I think we could be fairly or feel fairly reassured that a government made up by the Rainbow Coalition of opposition parties would be very seriously committed to transatlantic and European values, I'm arguing that even an opposition victory would pose very serious challenges for international partners. In the case of both scenarios, the election result baseline is that potentially due to a more successful mobilization over the last week of the campaign, or a sudden scandal on the government side, or a sudden breakdown of the government campaign, the opposition will win with a narrow majority in spite of the unfair elections and the tilted playing field. And the main trigger of the two scenarios is how the new democratic Hungarian government will address the issue of constitutional capture in the country. And in this scenario, titled Shockwaves of the Revolution, the Hungarian government opts for the strategy to a kind of constitutional revolution, amending of the basic law, Hungarian basic law, by a simple majority, and violating that way the Hungarian constitutional order in a procedural sense. And it's a very important dimension in this case that over the past 12 years, the Orbán government has never, ever violated the Hungarian constitutional order in this way. And of course, that will again pose a very serious dilemma for Euro-Atlantic partners and especially the European Commission. If it is not responding to a kind of Polish-style violation of the Hungarian constitutional order, then it can be very easily accused of double standards. Of course, at the domestic scene, we can expect widespread protests, and the supporters of Fidesz will accuse the government with practically a constitutional coup d'etat, and will try to frame themselves as the protectors of democracy and rule of law in Hungary. However, if the European Commission decides to impose sanctions over the new government of Hungary due to the violation of the Hungarian constitutional order, then it would practically punishing the democratic revival of an EU member state, which has been autocratizing over the past 12 years, which reached a kind of constitutional capture due to the ineffective EU responses to that autocratization, and which is in clear breach of the EU's fundamental values. And practically, the Hungarian government would also argue in the direction that due to the nature of the constitutional capture in the country, such a constitutional revolution is indispensable. And there is no other way out from the situation created by 12 years of constitutional engineering under Prime Minister Orbán, just such a very radical move, even if that may in some regard put also significant burden on the European partners of the Hungarian government. In this case, I think we can only hope that politics would trump rule of law, just it has trumped over the past 12 years, and the European institutions would accept that there is no other option for re-democratizing Hungary than just breaching the rule of law in a procedural sense. And that compliance with EU law only can be re-established in that way. And very briefly, coming to the last scenario titled Facing the Deep State, the election baseline is similar, just the Hungarian government is opting for a different strategy out of fear from domestic violence and also from potential negative international reactions. And this strategy is based on a kind of muddling through and trying to address the challenge of constitutional capture in the country by the judiciary, by investigating former corruption cases in the country and try to solve the problem with means and tools of criminal law. Of course, this scenario is based on the assumption that that all of the Fidesz nominees, which were placed or put in position over the past 12 years, will act in accordance with Hungarian constitutional law and in a good faith, and not as a subversive agents of a political deep state established by Fidesz. And of course, life will test that assumption. But in the worst case, I think it is important to emphasize that if there will be a full-fledged Fidesz political blockade, then the new Hungarian parliamentary majority will not be able to pass a single act. Because if the president challenges, for example, the constitutionality of all acts passed, and the Constitutional Court, which is captured since 2013 and full of Fidesz elected judges, will sit on the cases, then practically any legislation in the country will be able to be put on ice. And if the Hungarian parliament will not be able to adopt the next year's budget, it means or can mean a dissolution of the Hungarian parliament and pre-term elections as early as the spring of 2023. Concerning the foreign policy implications, that is practically the most comfortable scenario for Western partners, because they get a Hungarian government strongly committed to NATO and EU structures without any sort of domestic developments putting significant burden on the shoulder of the partners. However, the main problem is that as nice this scenario is, it is as unsustainable. And in this regard, it is, I think, a very important reminder for international partners that there is no easy way out of the autocratization of Hungary, not even for international partners. They also share some responsibility in the autocratization processes of the last 12 years. And they also have to share some of the political and legal burdens of a kind of challenging re-democratization of Hungary, because if they push the Hungarian government into the direction of this fifth scenario in case of an opposition victory, then the gain, what they receive in the short term, will not be sustainable in mid and long term. And just a very last phrase, due to the fact that the unity of EU and NATO is or has the highest importance for international partners, I would like to emphasize that this also increases the chance that the Hungarian opposition will opt for the shockwaves of the revolution scenario, because they know that for international partners, keeping the decision-making capability of EU and NATO is the most important issue, and potentially they will also turn a blind eye to the breach of the rule of law by the opposition, as they turned a blind eye to the breach of the rule of law and democracy by the Orban regime over the past 12 years. And sorry if I was a bit longer than originally planned. I just tried to very briefly summarize these 5 scenarios, but thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and not to worry about time. I think it was certainly worth it. I mean, first of all, I think it was very well structured and gave us sort of, once again, a good illustration for why these sort of scenario exercises or that sort of thinking is so useful. Now, obviously, there wasn't really any bright spot, I think, in these scenarios. I don't know whether that's the sort of famed Hungarian optimism, or whether it is really the direness of the situation. Any of these scenarios really come with massive dilemmas, both on the inside and on the outside. But perhaps our 2 commentators can help us find some of those bright spots, if there are any. Zsuzsanna, what is your take on these scenarios? And perhaps as an additional request to you, since you're also in particular looking at Central Europe, what are sort of the ripples from those Hungarian elections on the direct neighbors, especially also the Visegrad group that you're looking at professionally? Zsuzsanna, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and also thank you, Daniel, for fleshing out these scenarios for us. Definitely a lot to digest and to think about. I also think that scenario exercises are pretty valuable, but they also come with the constraints that we need to fix certain variables and exclude certain variables. So thank you very much, Jörg, for the prompt, because this is exactly what I would like to do, to bring in some extra variables and play around with the scenarios a bit more along those lines. Daniel presented the fake Atlanticism scenario where Fidesz, the current governing parties, Fidesz and the Christian Democrats, would be winning with a majority, but not with a constitutional majority. And considering the most recent polls, this seems to indeed be the most likely scenario. So this would be the first which I would like to touch upon, and I will certainly not go through all 5. Daniel said that in this scenario, with Fidesz winning with a majority, but not with a constitutional majority, there would be a need for adjusting direction and also broadening the electoral base of Fidesz to kind of regain support further down the road. And here I would like to point out that actually, according to a recent opinion poll done by the European Council on Foreign Relations on Hungary and Hungarian voter preferences, this would actually be hard. So adjusting along foreign policy lines would not necessarily broaden the base for Fidesz, because foreign policy preferences are very much aligned with party preferences, as well as with how voters view the importance of the rule of law and democracy and what role they see for the European Union. So adjusting just along one of these lines will not win voters over for Fidesz. So this puts the party in a position where it is probably stretching to its maximum at the moment, and without major reshuffle in all areas, what we will see in the elections is, under the current circumstances, the best the party can do without adjusting everywhere. So that's one point. I agree with Daniel that the most likely scenario, if the Fidesz party, Fidesz government wins, is a protracted balancing act. I also do not expect a U-turn, because it would come with fairly high domestic costs. But this also means that Fidesz would keep on doing the bare minimum to satisfy allies and not alienate Russia in this case, so not even its closest partners. So what would this mean? It would mean that the bare minimum will certainly not regain trust of allies in Hungary. We are seeing signs that the current strategy is actually alienating Hungary's closest partners in the region, namely Poland. And this is something I would like to come back to. And third, we also see that this balancing act for the moment actually does not win Hungary any sort of differentiation from the side of Russia. Hungary also landed on the list of unfriendly countries, which under the current demand of the Kremlin would need to pay for gas in rubles. We'll see how that goes, of course. But so far, we do not see a differentiation. And this is probably actually for the benefit of Hungary for the moment, because it at least saves some face. Now back to my additional variable here, Poland, and the role of the region. What we have seen in recent days is that the behavior of the Hungarian government is not resonating well with its Visegrad partners, and that to say the least. We just learned that the meeting of the ministers of defense of the Visegrad group had to be cancelled because after the check, defense minister. Also, the Polish defense minister declined to join. And I think this is very important signaling from the Visegrad partners towards the current Hungarian government and the current strategy. This goes way beyond than readers of Gazeta Polska not showing up at the peace march on March 15 in support of the governing party. So I think this is really important. And here we again have one more variable that we need to consider, namely how the war is going to go in Russia. Because if the war is prolonged and is not going in favor of Russia, then we will see increasing frustration from the Polish side. And I think this is a point where we may see a break between PiS and Fidesz. This is a moment also for Poland, the Polish government, to distinguish itself from Hungary towards the European Union, and potentially to already start thinking about the Polish elections coming up next year, where it would look increasingly bad to be considered as a friend of Viktor Orbán from the side of Polish society. So this is a point where I think how Poland reacts to Hungary will be crucial. Normally, I would not think that the PiS government would abandon Fidesz and its partnership, its alliance with Fidesz. But if the war goes on, if Russia is not winning, and for the moment it seems that Ukraine is holding out, sanctions will probably increase, pressure will increase. So in this situation, I think the PiS government will be increasingly likely also to break ties with the Hungarian government, and we see some signaling in that direction in the past few days. Question is how far this would go. Potentially, if there is an increasing pressure also from the side of the Hungarian government, in such a scenario, Poland could play the cards to redeem itself by actually, in this case, agreeing to block voting rights for Hungary to push forward with sanctions against Russia. I think this is fairly a make or break issue for Poland. In this scenario, however, one more variable that I think we need to consider is how domestic politics will look after an election success of Fidesz, and how the opposition will fare after the elections, whether the six parties will fall apart, which would be devastating for future chances of the opposition, or whether they can keep together and through that put increasing domestic pressure on the government by being a constant presence in the parliament, and also put pressure on the Hungarian government internationally. So I think if this scenario goes ahead, we have a series of extra variables that we will need to consider. And I said I will not go through all the scenarios, so just one more thought on the last one. If the opposition wins, I also agree with Daniel's point that this would be essentially an uphill battle for the opposition, indeed due to the state capture. However, a few steps that the opposition can take in such a case are crucial and can have an influence on how things develop domestically, even if this government turns out not to last. First of all, joining the European Public Prosecutor's Office will be crucial. And I think the Hungarian opposition is very much inspired by what we have just seen in Bulgaria and the Czech Republic, for one. For two, in this scenario, although it would indeed result in a lot of structural blockade, I think this is the scenario where actually Hungary would have the best chances to get access to EU funds, which then the new government could negotiate how and where it should be spent. And potentially, if pushed through quick, this could lock in EU funding into certain areas that can further on facilitate transition away from Hungary's current reliances on Russia, which could be to the longer term benefit of the country and could reduce, of course, it's not a very short term prospect, but could reduce those influences on the country that we see today. So I would leave it here. We can, of course, and I'm sure we will circle back to other scenarios too.
Thank you very much. We'll certainly come back to the other scenarios. I'll certainly also ask Dominik, who's next, to look perhaps also at some of those other scenarios that Zsuzsanna hasn't gone into as much. I think in particular, I'd also like you to ask to sort of make that bridge that nobody has been able to escape, neither Daniel nor Zsuzsanna, but to make it even more explicitly when it comes to Russia, the war in Ukraine, because this is an area that you're looking at professionally and in particular. So over to you for your take on the scenarios and this particular Eastern aspects. Dominik.
Thank you very much. I will definitely elaborate on that questions as well. But first, going back to the presentation of Daniel and also responding to the comments made by Zsuzsanna, I just want to touch upon very briefly about the elections first and the potential foreign policy implications second. As for the outcome of the election, largely agreeing with my fellow panelists, the baseline scenario is that Fidesz will win, the ruling Fidesz party will win the elections, either with most likely with an absolute majority rather than a constitutional one. And bringing Russia into the picture, I just want to give some of the main reasons behind this. One is, and this is how the election campaign currently plays out, is that there is a very big battle of narratives right now. The opposition is campaigning with the narrative of choosing the West over the East, while Fidesz has chosen a largely geopolitically neutral message, saying that they are the party of peace, while they blame the opposition for being the party of war. This is also this message is elevated by an extremely big disinformation and propaganda message maintained by the pro-government media outlets in Hungary. This message resonates very well in society, and in this regard, I believe that the opposition, which obviously does not want Hungary to be part of this war, it has unfortunately lost that political battle, even though they never made such promises. The second is why a Fidesz win is very much possible is the Hungarian desire for stability. We are living in a time of crisis, and Hungarian people could very well choose to rally around the flag and go with the experienced politician instead of an experimental, ideologically diverse and potentially unstable coalition of 6 very different parties. The third is that something which is not directly in connection with the war, but we should definitely not forget about this, is that the Hungarian government, the Orbán government, has been implementing a massive pre-election spending program across the country, targeting possible groups that could favor Fidesz in the elections in terms of their vote. Obviously, the single most important issue currently in the Hungarian elections is the war and how the two sides are responding to the war. But this is also something that could be decisive for undecided voters, less geopolitically minded voters, especially in the Hungarian countryside, in the Hungarian regions. So we should not forget about that either. As most of us have already pointed out, an absolute majority for Fidesz is more possible, but due to the inconsistencies in the opposition campaign, a constitutional majority could not be ruled out either. And I would like to just very briefly add to the current scenarios that it is also possible that there could be other formations in the Hungarian parliament, although less likely. But we should remember, I should point out that there will be 4 other parties on the ballot paper this Sunday. And of these 4 parties, one party, the far-right, pro-Kremlin and anti-vaccination Our Homeland Party, is practically on the verge of getting into parliament. It is unlikely that it will do so, but we will have to calculate with that possibility as well, because while Fidesz has been forced to communicate both ways, not to alienate its pro-Russian voter base, but to keep those of its voters who do see Russian aggression in Ukraine. While Fidesz does this approach, Our Homeland is free to fuel the fierce anti-Ukrainian narrative, which is very high among the Hungarian electorate, very much particularly due to tensions between the Ukrainian and Hungarian governments over language and educational issues for ethnic Hungarians in Western Ukraine, in the Zakarpattia region. So this could also be important in the sense that if Our Homeland gets into parliament, there could be a minority government of Fidesz supported by Our Homeland, and there could be other possible scenarios as well. But we do have to talk about the opposition, because for the first time in 12 years, they are standing united, which practically means the first real shot in an unbalanced competition that clearly favors Fidesz due to all the institutional resources the ruling party has, which the opposition doesn't. An opposition victory could be possible for 3 reasons. One is the unity, which is an unprecedented case. Second, also relating to the war in Ukraine, is that what we see right now is a general failure of strategic thinking by Prime Minister Orbán, who basically betted on Russia against the West, and now this strategic decision to align Hungary with Russia has turned out to be a failure. And many voters in Hungary believe that this failure is strategically not good for the country's perceptions on the long term. But there's also a third reason, which is that the Hungarian election this Sunday will come down to the constituencies and not the popular vote. Of the 199 MPs, 106, so the majority of them, will be elected through constituencies. And although there are polls saying what could happen, I have to briefly add that due to the fact that the opposition is united and they are standing on a one-on-one race against Fidesz, the race is just unpredictable. So we cannot entirely rule out an opposition victory either. Either way, however, if Fidesz wins the elections, we should expect major turmoil. We have to, at this point, I have to recall the 2018 post-election protests over the public dissatisfaction with Fidesz winning the election. And Hungary could actually very well find itself in a situation to the one Georgia had in 2020, when the opposition decided to not to accept the results of the vote. If the amount of irregularities come together in a way that constitute a higher level of dissatisfaction, then the opposition could choose to go this way as well. The opposition candidate for PM, Péter Márki-Zay, has numerous times hinted at his opinion that the vote could be rigged. And one key aspect in this regard is that we are going to have, for the first time again in many, many years, opposition delegates in every ballot stations across the country, due to a well-coordinated attempt by the opposition to make the vote more clearer and more fairer. So if there are reasons to be concerned about in connection with the clearness of the vote, then these attempts will be very likely uncovered. And just very briefly about the foreign policy implications raised by Daniel and Zsuzsanna, I will have to agree that what we will most likely see is a half-hearted and superficial realignment by the Orbán government if Fidesz wins the elections. We have to point out, I have to point out that basically Fidesz has created a voter base that is a significant part of which, we don't know exactly how much, but a significant part of which is pro-Kremlin, pro-Russian. They favor Russia over the West. There is also a significant share in the Hungarian electorate, as pointed out by a recent Globsec survey, for instance, that many Hungarians accept this East-West balancing act instead of going into either that or this camp. And Orbán just cannot risk alienating his voter base on the long term, because he has plans to stay in politics regardless of if he wins or loses this election. The only potential situation when Fidesz could show a stronger alignment towards the Western position is if something very tragic happens in the Hungarian populated region of Ukraine, in the Zakarpattia region, by the Russian forces. Obviously, the tendencies of the war currently do not show towards that direction, but since Fidesz is very fiercely advocating for ethnic Hungarians across the Carpathian basins, it might be the start of a shift. And in the post-election situation, if Fidesz decides to carry out another approach, that will be most likely seen in the form of government's restructuring, particularly in the Hungarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We will have to very carefully focus on how the government will be structured after the elections, because that could be the signal of a continuing foreign policy and a changing foreign policy as well. And very much briefly upon the opposition, in just not more than 1 minute, I would like to point out that yes, we can expect basically a full realignment with the Western values. The real question in this regard, how the opposition will position itself in a constitution building process. It is also very likely that that Hungary's international partners from the West would rather favor keeping the unity, both in the case of an opposition government and the Fidesz government. Therefore, rule of law issues could very well be taking a backseat at this point. I would stop here. Thank you for the opportunity for raising my points. And I am happy to answer any questions in relation to what can be expected on Sunday and beyond.
Thank you very much, Dominik. Excuse me. As everybody is still thinking of their questions, let me perhaps go ahead with some of my own, and I'll try to sort of focus these questions on the sort of inside of Hungary, as it were, at the moment, because I guess we'll have more questions also coming still on the outside. I mean, first question that I would have is the role of Hungarians abroad. I mean, this is obviously a factor that has been in Hungarian elections before, both those minorities in neighboring countries, as well as many of those that reside in, including here in Berlin, having left Hungary, especially also during the Orban years. So perhaps you can all three unpack a little bit what the role of the Hungarian voters abroad could be. The second, and this relates to obviously also Russia and Russia's actions. How does 1956 figure in this entire context? Because I hear from colleagues in, for instance, Slovakia, that 1968 is a big sort of reference point for instance, Slovaks, certainly also Czechs. So I was wondering whether 1956 sort of figures in this entire discussion. And the third question, also somewhat related to this, is Hungary is one of the 4 countries that are to see a forward positioning of NATO troops along the lines of what we saw in the Baltic states and Poland over the last years already. This is to be replicated now in Hungary, as well as Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Does that play any role in the current debate? Because it touches upon some of the axioms, Dominik, that you also described: the party of war against the party of peace, stability, and so forth. So perhaps on these 3 questions, let's start with Daniel. Why don't you go ahead?
Thank you so much, Jörg, and thank you for these questions. I think all of them are really crucial from the current perspective of Hungarian politics. Still, if you allow me, I would like very briefly to respond 2 points which were made by my fellow speakers, practically both by Zsuzsanna. The first one is really the opportunity of the Hungarian opposition in case of the 5th scenario. And in this regard, I don't think that there are any silver bullets available for the opposition, for the very simple reasons that, for example, joining the European Public Prosecutor's Office, what you mentioned, that won't have any retroactive effect. So practically, EPPO could investigate corruption cases from the day when Hungary joined the institution. And it's not offering any sort of increased leeway from the new Hungarian government to deconstruct the constitutional capture. And the second one, I completely agree with you that the real elephant in the room are Polish-Hungarian bilateral relations. Hungary only has had really one strategic bilateral ally over the past 7 years, and that was Poland. Where I slightly disagree with you is really what can be expected in this relationship. Because I think that all of the conflicts, what we see now, also the cancelling of the defense minister meeting, are really part of a kind of symbolic messaging and superficial conflict. Of course, the Polish government can be disappointed, but cannot be surprised over the Hungarian government's position with regard to Russia. So practically, they can be surprised that the lady is not for turning. But the Hungarian government is following a consequent path in this regard. And I think that at the end of the day, there will be no break or make minute or moment for this relationship, because the Poles are also knowing that having this kind of mutual defense pact with the Hungarian government is also their life insurance in the European Union. The situation of the rule of law in Poland is not getting better just because Russia attacked the Ukraine. And of course, now the rule of law question is fading away from the public agenda, but sooner or later we'll return to it. And in that moment, Poland will need a kind of illiberal ally to protect their positions and voting rights in the European Union, except they find a way how to get rid of Justice Minister Ziobro and his party, and how to restructure the Polish government in another form which offers them new majorities in the same. But at the end of the day, I completely agree with you that the life insurance of EU is, in the case of a Hungarian blockade in very sensitive moments, related to any sort of further Russian aggression or escalation, to simply suspend the voting rights of the Hungarian government with Article 7 TEU. And yes, in case of a very significant escalation, I can imagine that the Poles also could support that position. But that's really, I think, the question of the extremes. Concerning the role of Hungarians living abroad, of course, that's a very broad topic, and I just would like to touch upon one potential issue, and that is related to voter tourism, which was allowed by an amendment of the Hungarian legislation by the parliament in November, which practically gives the opportunity to Fidesz to re-register Hungarians living abroad into battleground districts without effectively living there. And it's a very powerful tool to manipulate even election outcomes in embattled single mandate districts. And as far as I'm aware, fortunately, that scenario is not manifesting. Most of the municipalities agreed to report on a regular basis about changes in the electoral registers. And of course, I'm also a bit puzzled whether the opposition now has the appropriate resources to monitor that changes. But until now, there was no reporting about serious irregularities that suddenly certain thousand new voters emerged in one or another single mandate districts. Regarding 1956, I don't know whether my co-panelists will agree with me, but I think the role of the 56 narrative is surprisingly limited. Of course, it is used by the Hungarian opposition, although at least perhaps that was my impression, that first the Ukrainians started to operate with the narrative, which is rather a bit shaming from a Hungarian perspective. But on the one hand, it's interesting to see how the Hungarian opposition narrative is focusing on the future and the future strategic choice between the geopolitical alignment or anchoring of the country on the western side or the eastern side of the continent, and not on past narratives. And second, it underlines what really 12 years of concentrated and well-organized propaganda in a hand-controlled media system can really cause. Because the core Fidesz electorate between 2010 used to be one of the most outspokenly anti-communist and anti-Russian electoral strata in the Hungarian society. And now 12 years Fidesz propaganda could significantly alter that situation. Which is again, perhaps an explanation why the narrative of 1956 is not resonating anyhow in the Fidesz electorate, although it could be seen in a symbolic way, highly challenging for Prime Minister Orbán, obviously. And regarding NATO, very, very briefly, I think it's just a further proof of this protracted balancing game. Because the legal base for the stationing of this NATO battle group was already laid down, if I remember well, more than 2 weeks ago by the Hungarian government in a simple decree which didn't get any bigger publicity, of course, in the Hungarian government friendly media. And Hungarian government members just made contradicting statements whether Hungary really needs NATO to protect the country's sovereignty and borders or not. And what we see is that on the one hand, Hungary is agreeing to the stationing of a battle group on the territory of the country, although in a very strange way, just limited to the western part of the country. Meanwhile, the Hungarian pro-government media is continuously questioning the role of NATO, whether Russia really poses a threat to NATO countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and also relativizes Russia's responsibility and partially put it on NATO's side in this conflict. But I'm ending at the point and over to my fellow speakers.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. Before I pass it on to Zsuzsanna, let me throw in 2 additional questions for you two that have come in the Q&A function. The one's a relatively simple one from Mike Hennig. What's the expected turnout? Sort of, I mean, always is a key figure in elections, and certainly one that helps one side or the other, depending on where those turnouts spike. What's the sense there? Because that's data that sort of goes beyond the opinion polls, perhaps a little bit. The other questions from Anna Wojcik. What is it that's baffled all of you most in the campaign so far? I mean, things that happened either on the government side or on the opposition side. Anything that particularly illustrates also the tilted playing field. Daniel has given some examples also, or also examples for campaigning on the part of the opposition in order to navigate this field. Any sort of episodes, as it were, illustrations that you may have on this. This is the question from Anna. Over to Zsuzsanna.
Thank you, Jörg. I feel now compelled to first react to Daniel, of course. Just to clarify, the scenario I also laid out about Poland and Poland potentially going with suspending Hungarian voting rights under Article 7 is definitely not what I consider most likely. So what I've been trying to say is, if that would happen, then probably this is the topic around which it could potentially go ahead, in case, of course, there is escalation, if there is a behavior from the Hungarian side that risks breaking that unity, which is crucial from the Polish perspective. So definitely don't take me the wrong way. I'm not saying that this is a likely scenario, but if this happens, then probably this is a setup where it could potentially. Regarding the Hungarians abroad, I would just add to what Daniel was saying, is that we have 2 big groups. Of course, there are Hungarians abroad in the Carpathian Basin who would have citizenship but no residency in Hungary. They can vote via mail. And in this geographic region, it's typically 98% Fidesz. Now, we will have 2 groups within Hungarians that have emigrated. Part of these are those who no longer have registered addresses living in probably Western Europe somewhere. They can also only vote via mail. Now, this will be, I would think, a much more mixed batch. These people voting for a list would be fairly divided between opposition and governing parties. We don't have exact data on this, how that vote would be divided, but what we can maybe base some suspicions on is how the Hungarians abroad voted in the EP elections in 19, and there we have seen that there was a majority for the opposition parties overall, but the single biggest party that still took the biggest share of the vote was Fidesz. Now, obviously, we cannot directly translate that result to the parliamentary elections, but probably this is the closest data we have here. And then there are those Hungarians living abroad who still have a registered address in Hungary and have to go to an embassy or consulate to vote abroad. And we see that their access to exercise their right is really limited compared to the Hungarians who can vote via mail. Nonetheless, these people are the ones who probably would be voting more opposition, but we will not really know the exact numbers and shares because they also vote in their individual constituencies, which means that their ballots will be counted in those constituencies. Where they matter, though, is that considering the current setup where we have really tight races between two key candidates across the country in these constituencies, in battleground districts, their shares can potentially influence the vote, but we don't really have exact numbers on this. Regarding the turnout, maybe I've seen polls that were indicating that it would be probably one of the highest turnouts that we had since the regime change. I even saw numbers up to 80%, which would be really high. And I'm somewhat skeptical about that. But among those who have a party and are committed to a certain party, there is over 80% willingness to go to the vote, go to the ballot boxes, both among opposition and government party voters. And what baffled me the most, shortly, two things maybe. One is how much of a non-issue the referendum in the end seems to be about this child protection referendum of the government. Yet it still comes in handy because for the government because it can increase its spending on the campaign as the initiator of the referendum. So that would be one thing. I certainly expected that gender, LGBT topics and the referendum will be central for this electoral campaign. And if the war did not happen, probably it indeed would be. And the second is just the immense spending we see on social media through various channels. Obviously, there is the spending from the parties, but we need to mention also sort of governmental, government-organized, non-governmental organizations, for example, Megaphone, which is an organization promoting certain influencers who are spreading the governmental messages. According to Facebook's ad library, which makes it public how much certain channels have spent on political advertising since 2021, April 15, Megaphone has already spent through about 10 channels over 1 billion forints. Now that would be, if I convert it correctly, around 300 million euros. Daniel, you're shaking your head. Then you can help me out.
Daniel, go calculate.
It would be around 30 million euros.
30 million. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So that is immense, even if it's just a tenth of what I was saying. But that's immense. And the importance of social media, I think, is unprecedented.
Thanks a lot, Zsuzsanna. Over to Dominik. Before I do that, there is a question that sort of particularly probably relates also to your area of expertise, comes from Stefan Schmidt, and is about the Hungarian minority in Ukraine, in Zakarpattia, and its history of actually backing pro-Russian parties in Ukraine. You've seen the question, perhaps you can also in particular drill down this one. Other than that, feel free to still pick and choose from those questions that we posed earlier, but Daniel and Zsuzsanna already gave us a pretty good set of responses to those. Dominik.
All right, thank you. Just very briefly on the role of Hungarians abroad. 4 years ago, they meant 1 MP for Fidesz. Now Fidesz is mobilizing to probably secure 2 MPs out of this ethnic Hungarian vote in the Carpathian basis, which could be a game changer if they win a 2/3 majority. On 1956, Fidesz has completely abandoned its former stance of being an anti-communist party. They are on the domestic agenda. They are like as if Hungary was neutral between Europe and Russia. This is the domestic campaign scene right now, and my assumption is that they felt that Hungarians are really afraid of getting plunged into this war. This is also amplified by the pro-government propaganda accusing the opposition of dragging Hungary into the war. But very much unfortunately, this historic importance, this event of historic importance is not that relevant in this context anymore. On NATO, while I do encourage everyone to read Daniel's policy paper, I would like to also add one aspect about the far-right Our Homeland Party, which would be by far, I think, the most unfortunate scenario for Hungary's Euro-Atlantic partners if they get into the parliament, because they are strongly NATO skeptic and very much favor the Kremlin ideologically. This doesn't necessarily mean that it would create a situation that would shift Hungary away further from the EU, but what we can see very interesting scenarios after the Sunday vote. On the turnout, it was 70% 4 years ago. It will be high this time as well. And my assumption is that the higher the turnout will be, the better it will be for Fidesz. As for what has been the most baffling, probably the sense that you cannot really differentiate Hungarian pro-government narratives from those on Russian state TV right now, which is really unfortunate thing again. And as for the Hungarian minority in Ukraine, I do have to add quickly that I have unfortunately not seen the corresponding questions. So can I ask you, Jörg, to ask the question on ethnic Hungarians in Ukraine?
The question is whether you can say anything about the Hungarian minority in Ukraine and its legacy of voting for pro-Russian forces in the past, in Ukrainian elections, that is.
Yes, just very quickly to highlight that besides the local government structures in the Zakarpattia region, Hungarians did have a tendency of choosing the party of regions. And this was also a defining case in the current situation of Ukrainian national politics. Right now, what we see is that Hungarians, there have been not polls that have reflected the stance of the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. We have polls from Ukraine about the overall perception of the war and the current political issues of Ukrainian society, but my sense tells me that there continues to be a very mixed approach towards Ukraine and its central government in Zakarpattia. The Hungarian government outreach to ethnic Hungarians in not just Ukraine, but also in Romania and in Slovakia and in Serbia has made these ethnic minorities very closely aligned with Fidesz. As it has also been pointed out, this was a very important election tactic by Fidesz to do so. But in general, just to sum up the situation of ethnic Hungarians in this regard, the majority opinion will not be the ones who will form the majority opinion in Ukraine, but they will continue to have mixed stances towards the central government, as well as the country's overall future, but not necessarily in the depth that is projected, for example, by Our Homeland, which the far-right party in Hungary, which has a completely worse perception of Ukraine.
Thanks a lot, Dominik. there is quite a steady stream of questions here, but I also see that we're running up against our time limit, so we have about 10 minutes left. What I would like to do, therefore, is I would like to give you each a particular question from that catalog and pipeline that there is in the Q&A function, with a request for a relatively brief answer on this. My first goes to Zsuzsanna. It also comes from Stefan Schwed. If we look at the moment at sort of everything that's happening around us, including then domestic dynamics that we're discussing here, it seems that what for the last couple of years has been observed as an international of authoritarians, sort of almost axis or alliance of authoritarian regimes, including obviously some inside of the EU, seems to be rather crumbling or under the impression of current developments. What's your take on that? Is there anything to that, or is that a hope that we perhaps overestimate in the moment? Zsuzsanna.
I would perhaps broaden it from authoritarian to also include populist and radical right. And I think this sort of international cooperation of these actors have also been heavily hit by the war. And in that regard, it certainly comes at the worst possible moment for the governing party in Hungary. So if we consider that for the past, by now, slowly 2 years, but intensively, maybe really the past 1 year. If we consider the investment Fidesz has been making to build this international alliance of these actors within the European Union, and all the visits, all the meetings, we see really little to show for it, for one, and also in general terms, and we also see very little in this current campaign. We have not seen high-level visits from allies of the Fidesz party. Obviously, the most useful would have been peace visits to Hungary during the campaign. We haven't seen that. The allies that Fidesz was trying to pull in from Western Europe, Rassemblement National, Lega, they turn out to be unacceptable partners at the moment, particularly for law and justice, and there are no visits to Hungary to support the campaign. The highest level of support that came for Fidesz was a letter from former President Trump on March 15, which may not be the best support and best recommendation letter either for the moment. So definitely, I do see it crumbling for the moment, but I do not see it as a bursting balloon for the long term. I think these parties, these partners will have a lot in common ideologically in the future as well.
Thanks, Zsuzsanna. Question to you, Dominik, on sort of Western unity and its impact on how a country or a regime like that of Viktor Orban can navigate sort of on different levels and in different directions. I mean, what we've seen with the Russian war against Ukraine is a pretty solid show of political unity by the West. I think we all have our suspicions that this may not last. We may see some divisions re-emerging already, but be that as it may, it's been a pretty strong show. Assuming that that remains in place, how does that limit the space for a government like that of Viktor Orban, if confirmed in office, to play its multi-vectorial game, to sort of play on divisions also within the European Union, for instance. What's your take on that? Doesn't that put a bit of a limit on the space that the Orban regime has to navigate?
Well, I'm a bit unfortunate to say that the answer is yes and no at the same time. Because if, for example, we take the account of the Viktor Orban we saw on the day the invasion began, we have seen the strong, mildly strong, but and the only condemnation and the open condemnation of calling out the aggressor, and the Hungarian PM also he has also promised to not to break EU unity. Basically, this sentence, this corresponding sentence, shows the cornered position he has navigated himself into with his balancing act with Russia. However, I believe that, although it is an assumption, but I have to say that the more cornered he will be on the EU level, the more likely he will be to express intentions to break away from the common EU/NATO position. Now, I'm specifically thinking about sanctions, because if we look back on the past years, Viktor Orban has always criticized EU sanctions against Russia, but has never crossed the red line of vetoing them. Now, the only reason why basically the Hungarian PM can maintain this criticism is towards any potential Russian sanctions, particularly on Russian energy, oil, gas, and nuclear, is that the majority is that there is a very open and serious debate on the EU level, and as long as the Central and Eastern European position, excluding Hungary, of course, is in minority, Orban can continue to be on the side of countries that are generally regarded or often criticized as being less hawkish towards Russia. Now, I'm specifically thinking about Germany and France and some of the other Western European countries. If this situation drags on, then Orban could choose to exploit this if he remains in power after Sunday. So this could also be a scenario for the future, which we have to take into account.
Thanks a lot, Dominik. Daniel, first of all, because you wrote a great paper that started us off in this discussion, you get a sort of bonus question. So it'll be 2 for you with my request for concise answers. The first came in the question answer stream and asked about the Hungarian minority in Romania. Clearly the largest in the Carpathian Basin. Perhaps a word on that minority and its approach to the conflict in Ukraine. The other question is the inevitable Germany question. We're both based here in Berlin, so Dominik indicated it already. There is a new government in this town here in Berlin. It follows a government that for many years basically facilitated the political, not just existence, but rise in many ways of Viktor Orban and his politics. What do we make of this new government and its approach to a perhaps continued Viktor Orban regime, or a potentially changing political constellation in Hungary? What's your take on that Germany angle? So the Hungarian minority in Romania and German politics vis-a-vis Hungary. Daniel.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. I would start with the second one. So with Germany, we saw practically early December that Prime Minister Orban chose the new German government as a sort of ideological counterpart or new ideological enemy within the European Union, without being able to trigger any sort of pushback in narrative sense from the new German federal government. And that will be very blunt, but my first take is that aquila non captat muscas, so practically the new German federal government has better things to do than to discipline the Hungarian government. What would be a kind of wishful thinking or expectations of many observers close to the Hungarian opposition? I think what we can objectively expect from the new German federal government is a kind of dual approach again. One, that of course it will be much more supportive in the EU structures, in multilateral formats, to enforce compliance with the rule of law in the European Union when this issue will be again on the agenda in mid or long term, but definitely not in short term. Berlin will not endanger EU unity now with pushing the issue. And the second one, that I don't expect that that these ideological differences or differences around the fundamental values of the European Union will pop up very sharply in the bilateral relations. So we all know Germany's traditional approach to Central and Eastern European countries, the emphasis on the historic responsibility of Germany and also on the principle of speaking with each other and not about each other. And I don't think, even if there is a general tendency which equals fundamental German positions and approaches with the Merkel, with the positions of the Merkel government. Of course, it's understandable after 16 years, but I think that these approaches are organic parts of the DNA of the German foreign policy. So we cannot expect any harsh criticism in bilateral formats. So practically that was the second question, and the first one regarding the Hungarian minority in Romania, very, very briefly. Of course, that's the most important and numerically largest Hungarian diaspora community in the Carpathian Basin, and also the most closely allied with Fidesz. So practically, there are two communities which are clearly in a kind of paternalistic relationship with Budapest. These are the communities, Hungarian communities in Romania and Serbia. And it is meaning that the structures of the local Hungarian parties are clearly supporting Fidesz and are contributing in a rather non-partial way to the management and the operational organizing of the gathering of the Hungarian votes in the region, which are casted as ballot mails. So, for example, we can see certain differences between the communities in the case of Slovakia and also in Transcarpathia. This is not the case in Romania. I would say that over 90%, as Zsuzsanna already mentioned, over 90% of the Hungarians in Romania are supportive to Fidesz. And there is a very well-established system to channel these votes into the Hungarian election system. And of course, we all know how many irregularities or potentials for irregularities are present in the system, that the electoral register is only supervised in every 10 years, that there can be a large number of already deceased voters. So the potential for irregularities is unfortunately very high in the case of Hungarians living in Romania casting their votes as ballot votes. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. This was a lot of questions that we got answered. Some of them may not have been addressed, but I'm afraid that time will not allow to answer any additional questions. First of all, thank you for this deep dive into Hungary. Many thanks to you, three speakers, to Daniel in particular for the paper that started us off, but all of you who joined us for this discussion. This was very rich and informative ahead of the elections on Sunday. Keep your fingers crossed for the elections, of course. If you are Hungarian, go and vote. Other than that, all that remains is to wish you all the best. Thank you again, stay safe, and hope to see you again soon in one of these formats. Thank you.